Hey guys, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you. Today we're going to have a discussion about what I mean by EDC or everyday carry. First of all, if you're totally new to the community, maybe you haven't heard this term a lot of times before. If you're new to knives, when people talk about EDC, they mean everyday carry, and it often refers to whatever it is that they carry with them every day: a knife, a flashlight, a pen, a lighter, whatever the case may be. Specifically, this video is going to zero in on EDC knives. So that is the knife you're going to have day in and day out in your pocket by your side every minute of every day, so that when you need a cutting tool, you've got it. All right. Now, a number of videos, the two that stand out to me were one, I had a discussion about, the best of 2019. I had a little discussion in that video where I talked about how one trend that I didn't like was moving toward thinner blades. And that's not to say that I don't like thin blades. Here's a good example of a knife I love, and the blade stock is not at all thick, okay? And so perhaps perhaps I overstated my point in that video and got some people thinking that I don't like thin blades, that everything has to be 1/4 of an inch thick, and that's certainly not my position. But in another video I said something about EDC, and so those two videos spawned a question from a couple of viewers, which I think was a really good question, and that is, when you say EDC, what is it that you mean? What are you thinking of? What are you looking for? All right, and so I've got a short answer and a long answer. I'm going to start with the short answer, and then we'll go into a bigger discussion. And I would love to have you weigh in down in the comments below, because there's going to be quite a bit of variety here. So for my purposes, when I say EDC, I mean a knife that you can carry day in and day out with, and that it'll do every kind of cutting task that you need to do. All right. So for me, that's a pretty wide swath. And so what I primarily look for in an EDC knife is versatility. That is, I want it to be able to cut everything from envelopes to carved wood and everything in between. All right. The things that kind of put me off are, knives that are ground in such a way that they don't cut very well, or that are so big and bulky that they're a little off-putting and I can't fit them in a lot of my pockets. The other end of the spectrum are knives that make me feel like I can't be confident in it to perform the jobs that I want it to perform. All right, so essentially versatility is my goal when I think of an EDC knife, and when I think of a knife that I could recommend to just about everyone. And we had a discussion about this a while back, remember, in my submission for the single best EDC knife was the American Lawman. Now, the funny thing is that's not even a knife that I carry a lot. In fact, I carry it relatively rarely, but I just feel like it really balances out a lot of the different factors that I'm interested in, okay? So now that I've given you the short answer, let me give you the longer answer. And I'm gonna point out here something that everybody knows, but we're gonna talk about it anyway. And that is knife use and knife preference, and the way we classify knives falls on a bit of a spectrum. Okay, so here's my representation of the spectrum. So on this end, we have sort of very light duty gentleman's folders. On this end of the spectrum, we have, hard use tactical folders, and we're limiting ourselves to folders, okay? Because here is a great EDC knife. This is the QSP, I can't remember what the name of it is now. Anyway, can't remember the name, but absolutely fantastic knife. I keep this with me in my bag, in the truck, various places. I love this knife, okay? Great knife, can definitely be workable as an EDC folder. However, notice the amount of space this is going to take up. All right, one, this is not going to just fit in most of my pockets. Here's a folder of similar size, Rat Model 1 that everyone's familiar with, and you can see that this becomes a much bigger knife. Well, not much bigger, but it's definitely a bigger knife, especially when I take this out of the sheath, and yet it takes up, when folded and put in my pocket, considerably less space. So that's the primary reason that we talk about EDC folders over fixed blades, although let it be said that I'm absolutely a fan of EDC fixed blades. And by the way, this is a great one. I did talk with QSP about it, and my only issue is the sheath. They are doing a different sheath for it, And when that happens, this may be one of the best EDC fixed blades available because it's comfortable in hand. The blade grind is great. Anyway, there's lots of good stuff about it. Let's get back to our discussion though. So in this spectrum, we sort of have crazy big, heavy duty, hard use stuff on this side. You could put the Cold Steel Formax or the SR1 down here. Over here, very light duty gentleman's folders. You could put slip joints here. You could put things that are, the mini, I don't know, all the little mini Spyderco knives, the Bug series and stuff would probably be down in this end where they're nice to have a cutting tool, but you don't want to get into any kind of serious job with it because it just won't do it, okay? Or at least it won't do it comfortably and confidently. So that's how I kind of think about it. And then in here, there's a massive range that includes tons and tons of knives that are absolutely adequate for everyday carry. Okay, and I actually argued that in a video a little while ago, and I think that may be the other video where some of the comments came from asking, what do you think of as EDC? And essentially my point there was, almost any knife, even if it's not totally perfect, maybe it's pushing this end of the spectrum, maybe it's pushing this end of the spectrum. The fact is, for most of us, most of the time, any decently built knife is probably going to work. Now, before I get into my own preferences, I have to add one more thing, okay? And that is a huge deal is going to be what you do, who you are, what your preferences are. Okay, so let me grab a couple of knives here and just kind of throw them in, and then we can talk a little bit about how everything is going to kind of break down. So I've got a few different knives here. I think all of these are pretty reasonably suited to EDC. This one might be a little on the large side, but I think, depending on who you are and what you do and who you're around and what their tolerance level is, okay, it could probably be fine. So that's the next thing we really have to say here, and that is, it depends on who you are and what your preferences are. All right, let's throw one more in here because I know this gets a lot of discussion when it talks about a knife to have in your pocket every day. So we've got Victorinox. This is the Swiss Champ, which is crazy big, but because it has everything in it. But there are much smaller options that work really well. Okay, so what is it that you do? If you're an accountant or a teacher, if you're a computer programmer, you're going to have a certain, you're probably working in an office most of the time. You're wearing like business casual most days, and that's going to give you certain preferences for which knife you want to carry. Okay, if you're a first responder, if you're a truck driver, if you're a doctor, if you're a preacher, if you're a construction worker, and on and on and on the list could go, that's going to change. Okay, so a lot of what you carry as an EDC knife is going to depend on who you are and what you do and what you need your knife for, okay, and what kind of people you're around. All right, so it's important, I think, to get that out there. And some, Nick, for example, he made the comment about the thinner blade stock that I disagreed with, and I still, I doubt, I don't know what Nick thinks of when he talks about thin blade stock, but one of the things I wanted to have the Swiss Army knife out here for is, to me, this is really thin blade stock. This is thinner than I want for my EDC. However, we don't move very far up the scale by the time we get to the Civivi Backlash. And if I put these side by side, you can see that it's thicker, but not crazy, okay? And this is a knife I'm pretty happy with and pretty comfortable with, where this I would consider pretty light duty. And even this, I would move to, if we get our spectrum out, this I would probably put over here in this area somewhere. This I would put sort of at the beginning of this area, okay? And I'm being a little subjective, okay? I'm well aware of that. Now, if we kind of keep going here, right? These two knives are actually pretty similar, and they probably are going to move. And even this knife. Now this knife's thicker, but it's ground different. So, you know, these knives are probably landing somewhere in here, okay? Now, we've talked a bit about that spectrum. We've talked a bit about different people's preferences and needs. Now let me give you the things that I kind of think of put a knife in a pretty nice sweet spot for my own everyday carry purposes. All right. Essentially, what I like to see in an EDC knife is something in, you know, the 8 to 9 inch range. It can be a little under 8 inches, but often, you know, this I think is a little under 8 inches, or it maybe just reaches 8 inches. And I love it. I think this is a great knife. Sometimes this is definitely under 8 inches, the Raven 2. And again, I think it's pretty nice and quite capable as an EDC knife. But again, this is a range, and this is my preference, okay? This is a little subjective, as I've already pointed out a couple of times. So I'm gonna like a knife that's, you know, between 8 and 8.5 inches is sort of my sweet spot, and I can go up to 9 inches, but I definitely, 9 inches is starting to get to the big side. All right, I want a knife blade length that's around 3.5 inches. If it's 3 1/4, is that too small? Not really. If it's 3 3/4, is that too big? No, not really. So again, there's a bit of a range in there. In terms of the handle, I want something that's comfortable and that gives me a 4-finger grip. I will say this I'm really a stickler on. If I don't get a good 4-finger grip and feel like I've got some space here, I just won't carry the knife. I've tried and tried, because, you know, there are some knives where I love the design and I really like something about them. If I don't feel like it's pretty hand-filling and pretty confidence-inspiring in hand, then I'm just not going to carry it. And I'll pick on one knife here that's really popular. The Benchmade 940, I like the design. There's a lot of things I like about that knife, but every time I've owned one, and I've owned a couple and I've tried way more, I just don't like the way they feel in hand. It's just too small. I feel like I need to wrap my fingers around it twice in order to sort of get a hold of it. And so then maybe that'll kind of capture for you what I mean by confidence inspiring in hand. In terms of the action, lockup, and deployment, I don't care what kind of lock it has. I don't care if it's a flipper or if it's thumb hole deployment, if I can flick it, if it's a compression lock, right? I don't really care that much about what style of lock it has, but what I care about is that it's simple and comfortable. All right, so I don't want a knife where I'm, you know, having to get a pry bar out to get the detent released. I want a detent that's nice, that allows me to flick the knife, but isn't too crazy stiff. I want it to be easy to close. It doesn't have to be drop shut, right? Again, here's an example. This knife is not going to drop shut for me, but it's very smooth. Here's another knife. It's not going to drop shut. It kind of, you know, you can play with it a little, but it feels great. It's easy. I don't have to do a lot of thinking, and I'm not uncomfortable at any time while I'm using the knife. Whoops. And I'm going to close the knife on my microphone cord. Don't worry, everything's fine. If you heard an interruption in the sound, I didn't cut through it or anything like that. So from the handle, that's what I'm looking for. In lockup and deployment, that's what I'm looking for. And finally, in terms of the blade, I want a steel that'll hold a good edge for, you know, a day of hard cutting. I don't want to feel like, you know, if I bring this knife in the bush with me and I'm camping, I'm going to have to, you know, I won't be able to do what I need to get done before I've got to stop and sharpen it. So my preference is certainly toward S30V or better, maybe 154 CM or better. But I still enjoy lots of knives that maybe aren't quite to that level. Something like this is, I said in the review of this, which I don't know if will be, I don't know if the review of this will post before or after this video, but I did mention in the review that I love this knife. I've carried it a ton, even though it is a cheaper, more budget-friendly steel, and it's not going to perform, say, as well as 154 CM, but it's close enough, and I'm not going to carry it if I think I'm doing so much cutting that I'm going to dull the blade out. Okay, so That's my preference for, steel is it just has to hold an edge for a reasonable amount of time. I don't need it to be like crazy Maximet forever, never have to sharpen this in your lifetime type of stuff. I don't really care that much about that. In terms of the grind, I want it to be thin behind the edge, okay? I don't really care if the blade stock is kind of thick. So here's an example. This is fairly stocky, okay? Fairly thick, hefty grind there. Something like this, again, similar idea, fairly hefty grind, fairly thick. But both of these knives are thin enough behind the edge that when I go to cut something, it cuts fairly readily. I don't have to have, I'm not really fighting with it. I've never felt like with any of the knives that I've shown you that the blade wouldn't cut something I really needed it to cut. Outside of the one exception is there are certain, root vegetables, carrots, beets, potatoes, maybe if they're really dry. There's certain vegetables that are just really, really firm and stiff. Okay, so that unless you've got like a thin kitchen knife, they're going to split. All right. And that can be a pretty good test if you want to go cut an apple in half and see if it slices or breaks open, and that'll give you a good idea. I like knives that don't usually break apples in half, depending a little bit on the brand of apple. All right. So a blade like this, for example, which is again pretty thick stock, pretty hefty build. This is the Crewware Shaman. I like this a lot because it's really, really well balanced. It's stocky, it's confidence inspiring, but it's still thin behind the edge and cuts really nicely. One knife I've had some issues with, the grind on certain hinderers can be a little thick. Certainly, I've never had good luck with Striders, and it's weird because I've had you guys comment about my take on this. I know there's other stuff going on with Strider as well. I'm not going to get into that. But the Striders that I've had just have not had great edge geometry and just haven't sliced very well. Now, I've heard others totally discount that and say, are you crazy? They slice really well. I don't know. Anyway, my experience has not been that Striders are great EDC knives because they're just too thick behind the edge. They're too heftily ground. All right, so that's my discussion on blades. I want it to cut, but I don't mind if it's thick. In fact, I like a thicker blade stock better, so long as it's ground in such a way that it still cuts pretty well. And that's one of the reasons I'm such a Cold Steel fanboy, because they seem to consistently get that right. Essentially, I'm looking for the same kind of principle that I described at the beginning. I want it to be versatile. I want to feel confident that whatever I'm trying to tackle, I'm not worried about whether or not my knife can do it. Okay, so when it comes to EDC, those are the kinds of things I'm looking for. We could talk more about bearings versus washers and a number of other things, but I feel like they're supplemental. And I've recommended for EDC lots of knives that have both options. I don't really care, again, about lock types. I've recommended all kinds of different lock types. And because, as long as it kind of works to keep the knife from closing on my finger, I will say a non-locking knife, I definitely move out of the EDC category. I put it more in the occasional category, and a knife that's too big. So let me lastly say this. And this is something you guys have argued with me about before, and that's totally fine. I'm happy for everyone to sort of have their own opinion about this. But there are some big knives like this, like my Formax and a couple of others, that I classify as occasional carry. And I would put this in there as well. Okay, and what do I mean by occasional carry? I'm saying if I know that the things that I'm going to deal with that day are not going to require a particular kind of knife, then I'll modify my carry that day. So is this the most ideal practical knife out there? By the way, this is the Morgan Cohen Keen. No, it's not. All right. But if I know that I'm probably not going to have occasion to pull my knife out in public, if I know that I'm going to the office or going for a hike in the woods or just wandering around town, I'll carry this knife. I have no problem. Now, I may carry something like this as a backup in case I need to cut something and I'm afraid the sheeple will freak out. Same thing is true in the other direction. If I know that I've got a light use day, I'm on a course and I know I'm just going to be sitting in a classroom watching PowerPoint all day, I probably won't carry something like this. I may carry something sort of in that middle EDC ground. Sorry about that. There we go. Or I may carry something that doesn't quite reach that level of EDC that I prefer. Okay, now I know I'm going to get a lot of pushback on on the Victorinox. For me, a knife there's a lot of versatility and a lot of value in having a locking knife. I know you should never use a knife that, even if it locks, you never use it as if it locks. I'm well aware of all of that. But again, I'm looking for a little extra versatility and a little extra confidence, which I don't find from a slip joint. All right, I'm happy to have all the SAK fans tell me I'm an idiot. Don't worry about that. I've been told that before, and I'm sure I'll be told it again. So the last thing that I wanted to point out here was just to have a little discussion about occasional carry. This, by the way, is very solidly EDC, but there are some knives that I put in a different class, which are, you know, a knife that I'm going to carry some of the time rather than all of the time. So let's bring in a bunch of knives here to kind of finish things off. All right, and hopefully that has given you some kind of a definition. I know 20 minutes is a long definition, but when I say EDC, that should give you some kind of understanding of what I'm talking about. All right. And I get that some of you will have a different definition of what that means. You know, you'll love slip joints for EDC, or you'll only EDC, you know, something crazy and big like a Recon 1 because you want that, you know, self-defense aspect, or you want that wilderness survival aspect. Okay. Hey, no argument here. All right. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. I put a link to DLT trading down here. I think a lot of the things that I've shown you here, some of the higher end stuff, some of the nicer stuff, DLT should carry. And if you use that link, it does help the channel out quite a lot. Okay, thanks a lot for watching. Thanks a lot for commenting. I'll say that in advance because I'm sure we're going to get some comments here. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe. Don't forget to use that DLT link. We'll talk to you soon.